Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You guys know how much we love diving into your requests. So today, we're tackling one that came up a lot of signs of autism in adults.
Definitely a topic that deserves its own deep dive.
I know, right? And we've got a really interesting excerpt to dig into from Cheap ABA. It's called, get this, Signs of Autism in Adults' Autistic Traits You Never Knew Existed.
Ooh, kitschy.
Right. I know I kind of chuckled when I saw it too. But it's true though, right? Like we often think of autism being diagnosed in childhood. So what does it even look like in adults, especially if those signs were missed earlier on?
That's the thing about the autism spectrum. It's so vast and present so differently from person to person.
Totally. Which is exactly why this idea of a hidden spectrum is so important. This excerpt really emphasizes how autism spectrum disorder doesn't always get picked up in childhood.
And many adults are living their lives without a diagnosis, not knowing why certain things might feel more challenging for them.
Okay, so let's get into it. The excerpt jumps right into social challenges, which immediately made me think about how often we're interpreting those more subtle signs in totally different ways.
Absolutely. And those misinterpretations can have a real impact on someone's life.
Right, like you might think someone is just being rude or standoffish when really there's something else going on entirely.
Exactly. The excerpt gives examples like difficulty with sarcasm, struggling to initiate or maintain conversations, or even a strong preference for solitude.
Yeah, like someone who always seems to be in their own world.
Right. And now imagine navigating a world that thrives on social interaction with these challenges.
It's like being stuck in a never-ending networking event.
And it's no wonder that many adults develop coping mechanisms or even learn to mask to fit in.
It's almost like social camouflage.
Exactly. They're blending in, but it takes a lot of effort.
And I bet it's exhausting having to constantly adapt and mask those natural differences.
You're hitting on a crucial point there. The emotional energy expended to blend in socially can be immense.
Oh, for sure, leading to exhaustion and even burnout.
And I think we've all been there, right?
Yeah.
Feeling socially drained after a long day. But imagine experiencing that on a whole other level every single day.
Wow, yeah. It makes you think about how often we might misinterpret those quiet or reserved individuals. Could it be that they're not being aloof, but rather just navigating social situations in a way that requires extra effort?
Exactly. It's about recognizing that everyone has their own unique way of navigating social situations.
And that sometimes those differences are rooted in something much deeper.
Absolutely. And, that actually ties into something else. The excerpt touches on the double empathy problem.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that. But honestly, I don't totally get it. Is it like you're feeling double the empathy?
Not quite. It's more about the idea that sometimes it's like we're speaking different languages, even when we're both speaking English.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this.
The double empathy problem suggests that much of what we consider normal communication is actually very neurotypical centric.
So for someone on the autism spectrum, understanding and being understood within that framework can be really tough.
Precisely. Imagine the constant effort of translating your thoughts and feelings into a way of communicating that doesn't come naturally.
It's like trying to fit square pegs into round holes day in and day out.
A very fitting analogy.
Yeah.
And it's exhausting just thinking about it.
Yeah, it makes your brain hurt. And this whole idea of communication differences really jumps out in the excerpt section on communication quirks.
Right. And these quirks might not be as obvious as you'd think, especially in adults.
Like, we often associate repetitive speech or taking things literally with childhood, right? But the excerpt points out that those tendencies can stick around in adulthood, even if they look a little different.
Exactly. It might be more nuanced, but the underlying differences are still there.
It's like the excerpt says, someone might struggle with understanding idioms or metaphors, but if they're articulate in other ways, those subtleties might get overlooked.
Imagine hearing a phrase like, "he spilled the beans." And instead of understanding the intended meaning, your brain gets stuck on the image of someone literally spilling beans.
Oh my gosh, I do that all the time. I'm always taking things so literally.
We all do it from time to time. But imagine experiencing that kind of misinterpretation on a regular basis throughout your life.
It really highlights that communication goes way beyond just words. It's about this whole other level of shared understanding that we often take for granted.
Exactly. And without that shared understanding, it's easy for misunderstandings and misinterpretations to arise, which can lead to all sorts of challenges in relationships, workplaces, and social situations.
And that shared understanding is a two-way street, isn't it? It's not just on the individual to try and conform to our way of communicating. It's on all of us to meet each other halfway.
Precisely. It's about creating a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and understood, regardless of their neurodiversity.
You know, that reminds me of something else you mentioned earlier. Those challenges that aren't always immediately visible, like sensory sensitivities.
Ah, yes. Sensory processing. It's often an overlooked aspect of autism.
Yeah, and the excerpt talks about sensory under the surface, and it really struck me how easy these things are to misinterpret or dismiss, especially in adults.
It's fascinating how we find ways to adapt, isn't it? We figure out these strategies to navigate a world that isn't always sensitive to our needs.
It's like having a secret decoder ring, only instead of deciphering messages, you're trying to modulate your sensory experience just to get through the day.
Exactly. You're constantly scanning the environment, anticipating potential triggers, and figuring out how to manage those sensations.
And then on top of that, people around you might not even realize what you're going through.
It's like having this whole internal world that most people are completely unaware of. And that lack of awareness can lead to misunderstandings and frustration on both sides.
Totally. It's like that saying, you never really know what someone else is going through.
And that's why it's so important to approach these conversations with empathy and understanding. We all have our own unique experiences and challenges. And what might seem like a small thing to one person could be a huge deal for someone else.
Absolutely. And the excerpt gives the example of someone wearing noise-canceling headphones. It's easy to assume they're just enjoying their music, but what if it's a way to manage overwhelming sensory input in a crowded environment?
Exactly. It's about recognizing that there are often invisible reasons behind people's behaviors,
Yeah.
and those reasons deserve to be understood, not judged.
It's like we can't always see the why behind the what, you know?
And even when we think we understand, there's always more to learn.
It's so easy to misinterpret those adaptations as personality quirks, too. Like, the excerpt talks about how a need for routine and predictability might be perceived as inflexibility, but in reality, it's often about maintaining a sense of sensory equilibrium,
It's about creating a sense of safety and predictability in a world that can feel overwhelming and chaotic.
especially for someone who might be highly sensitive to sensory input.
Right. And, that actually ties into another area the excerpt explores: camouflaged repetitive behaviors. You know how we tend to associate repetitive behaviors or stimming with childhood autism.
Yeah, it's one of those things that people often think about when they picture autism.
But stimming doesn't just disappear in adulthood.
Wait, really?
Oh, yeah. Adults stim too. It's just that those behaviors might take on different forms.
Oh, that's interesting. I never really thought about it like that.
It makes sense though, right? If stimming serves a neurological purpose, like regulating sensory input and emotional states, why would that need disappear in adulthood?
That's a really good point. So instead of those more obvious repetitive movements, you might see more subtle forms of stimming in adults.
Exactly. It might be something like fidgeting, pacing, tapping their foot, or even just needing to have things in a certain order.
Things that could easily be mistaken for everyday habits or quirks.
Exactly. And the thing is, these behaviors aren't always disruptive.
Right, like sometimes they can even be helpful, right?
Absolutely. The excerpt even mentions how strict routines might be perceived as simply being organized, when in reality they're often about managing those sensory and emotional complexities.
It's all about creating a sense of predictability in an unpredictable world, which, let's be honest, we all crave to some extent.
Exactly. It's a way to manage the chaos and create a sense of calm and control.
And you know, that actually makes me think about the excerpt's point about executive function in disguise. Like, executive function is all about planning, organization, time management. Those skills that can be tough for anyone, but especially for adults on the autism spectrum.
Absolutely. And these challenges can be really misconstrued, especially in a fast-paced work environment.
Imagine struggling to meet deadlines or juggle multiple tasks, not because you're lazy or unmotivated, but because your brain processes information and manages time differently.
It's like your internal clock is set to a different rhythm, and the world around you is constantly trying to speed you up.
And then you're judged for not being able to keep up when really it's not a lack of effort. It's a difference in how your brain works.
It's about recognizing those differences and creating environments that support neurodiversity.
Because when we focus on people's strengths and talents rather than their perceived weaknesses, everyone wins.
I couldn't agree more. And, this whole conversation has got me thinking about something that's often misunderstood when it comes to autism emotional expression.
Oh, interesting. I think I know where you're going with this. It's like, as adults, we're expected to have this whole emotional intelligence thing figured out, but for someone on the spectrum, it can be a lifelong journey of learning to navigate those complex waters.
Exactly. And the excerpt makes a crucial point about this. It's not about lacking empathy, as some people might assume. It's about processing emotions differently.
So someone might react in a way that seems disproportionate to the situation, or they might appear emotionally detached when they're actually feeling things very deeply.
It's not that they don't care. It's that their emotional experience might manifest differently on the outside.
It's all about recognizing that there are different ways of experiencing and expressing emotions, and that those differences are perfectly valid.
Precisely. And you know, this actually reminds me of something else. The excerpt touches on the power of unique interests.
Right, the unique interests now what section. I love this part because it's so true. It's fascinating how this aspect of autism can manifest in adulthood.
We often hear about children with autism having these really intense, focused interests. Right.
Yeah, like they're little experts on dinosaurs or trains or whatever they're passionate about.
Exactly. But those passions don't just disappear in adulthood. They might evolve, mature, become more nuanced, but that capacity for deep focus and passionate engagement often remains.
It's like having a superpower. Think about the incredible things people can achieve when they're deeply interested in a subject.
Absolutely. That deep dive, that laser focus, it can lead to incredible discoveries and innovations.
And yet, those passions are sometimes dismissed as niche or obsessive.
It's all about perspective, isn't it?
Because what one person considers an obsession, another might see as dedication, expertise, or a unique perspective that can benefit everyone.
And let's be honest, those diverse perspectives are what make the world such a rich and fascinating place.
You know, this whole conversation has me thinking about something else the excerpt mentioned that feels so foundational to all of this. Sensory processing. It's like this underlying thread that connects so many of the other points we've discussed.
It really is. And it's something that's often misunderstood or overlooked.
Yeah.
Because it's not just about disliking certain textures or sounds. It's so much bigger than that.
It's about how your brain is literally making sense of the world around you. Every sensation, every bit of input, it's all being processed differently.
And when you consider those differences in processing, so many behaviors that might seem quirky or odd suddenly start to make sense.
It's like, oh, maybe they're not trying to be difficult. Maybe their brain is just experiencing the world in a completely different way.
And that's not a bad thing. It's just different.
It's like that saying, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. The spectrum is so vast, and each individual experiences it in their own unique way.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to approach these conversations with curiosity and an open mind.
Because the more we learn about the diversity of human experience, the more empathy and understanding we cultivate, both for ourselves and for others.
And that's a beautiful thing.
And that's what makes these conversations so important, right? Because the more we understand, the more we can create a world that's truly inclusive and supportive of everyone.
1,000%. We all benefit from a neurodiversity affirming approach.
Preach. Okay, so we were talking about sensory processing and how it's this underlying thing that impacts so much of what we've been discussing today.
It's like the foundation upon which everything else is built. Because if your senses are giving you different information, or if you're processing that information differently, it's going to affect how you interact with the world around you, right?
It's like we each have our own unique set of sensory goggles that we're seeing the world through.
I love that analogy. And those goggles are constantly filtering and interpreting sensory input, shaping our experiences and influencing our behaviors.
Which brings us back to this idea from the excerpt, sensory processing, the unsung hero. It's not just about disliking certain sounds or textures, it's about how the brain makes sense of everything around us, which is wild when you really think about it.
It's like this constant flow of information bombarding our senses, and our brains are working overtime to make sense of it all.
And for someone on the autism spectrum, that processing might look different, which can lead to a whole range of experiences and responses.
And sometimes those experiences and responses might not make sense to someone who's not on the spectrum, which is why it's so important to approach these conversations with curiosity and an open mind rather than judgment.
Because if we start from a place of assuming that everyone experiences the world in the same way, we're going to miss out on a lot of valuable perspectives and insights.
Exactly. Diversity is what makes life interesting. And that includes neurodiversity.
So true. Okay, let's talk more about these less obvious signs, because I think that's where things get really interesting, especially when we're talking about adults. Because like we were saying earlier, a lot of those more classic signs of autism that people might be familiar with often present differently in adulthood, or they might be masked or misinterpreted.
And that's why it's so important to raise awareness about these less obvious signs.
Yeah.
Because the more we know, the better equipped we are to support each other.
Totally. Okay, so going back to the excerpt, one of the sections that really jumped out at me was emotional expression. It's like, as adults, we're expected to have our emotions all figured out, right? But for someone on the spectrum, it can be a very different experience.
Right, because emotional expression is often tied to social expectations and unwritten rules.
And those rules can be really subtle and confusing, even for people who don't have difficulty processing social information.
Absolutely. And for someone on the spectrum, those subtleties can be even more pronounced.
Like, imagine trying to read a map that's missing half the streets and landmarks. That's kind of what it's like trying to navigate social interactions when you're not picking up on those subtle cues that everyone else seems to understand instinctively.
Exactly. It can feel like everyone else is speaking a different language.
And then when you add in the emotional component, it's like things get amplified times 1,000.
Right. Because not only are you trying to understand the social dynamics at play, but you're also trying to make sense of your own emotions and how they're being perceived by others.
It's a lot to process. And I think that's why it's so important to remember that when it comes to autism, emotional expression isn't about lacking empathy.
It's about processing emotions differently.
And those differences can manifest in a lot of different ways.
Exactly. Someone might be very emotionally expressive, but their expressions might not always align with what others are expecting.
Or they might have difficulty reading other people's emotions, which can lead to misunderstandings and misinterpretations in social situations.
And it can also make it really tough to form and maintain close relationships because so much of intimacy and connection is built on emotional sharing and understanding.
It's like you're missing a key ingredient in the recipe for connection.
Exactly. And then on top of that, there's often this added pressure to mask those differences, to try and fit in and appear more neurotypical.
Which, as we talked about earlier, can be incredibly draining and lead to burnout.
It's a lot to carry around.
Yeah.
And it's no wonder that so many adults on the spectrum struggle with anxiety, depression, and other mental health challenges.
It's like you're constantly second-guessing yourself, wondering if you're saying the right thing, doing the right thing, feeling the right thing.
That kind of self-doubt can really take a toll on your self-esteem and sense of belonging.
Which is heartbreaking because everyone deserves to feel seen, heard, and understood for who they are, neurodiversity, and all.
I couldn't agree more. And, that actually brings us to another really important point, that the excerpt touches on the importance of accepting and celebrating those differences.
Yes, because neurodiversity isn't a deficit, it's a strength.
Absolutely. When we embrace neurodiversity, we open ourselves up to a world of possibilities and perspectives that we might never have even imagined.
It's like adding more colors to the palette, right? We create something even more vibrant and beautiful. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's what makes life so rich and interesting.
It's about recognizing that there's no one right way to be human, and that we all have something unique and valuable to offer the world.
And that includes people on the autism spectrum.
Now that's something worth celebrating.
I'll drink to that. Cheers to that.
Okay, so before we wrap up this awesome deep dive, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier because it feels like a really important piece of this whole puzzle.
Let's hear it.
It's this idea of the hidden spectrum and how easily autism can be missed or misdiagnosed, especially in adults and especially in women.
You're hitting on a really crucial point there. Because for a long time, autism was seen as something that primarily affected boys and men.
Right. And a lot of the diagnostic criteria and stereotypes are still based on that outdated way of thinking.
Exactly. And as a result, many women and girls who don't fit that narrow stereotype slip through the cracks.
It's like trying to find a single snowflake in a blizzard. It's there, but it's surrounded by all these other snowflakes that look really similar.
And those snowflakes might look really different depending on where you are in the world, right? Because cultural factors and societal expectations also play a huge role in how autism is perceived and diagnosed.
Oh, 100%. Like, what might be considered quirky or eccentric in
Right.
one culture
Yeah.
could be seen as a sign of something more serious in another.
Exactly. And then you layer on top of that all the systemic biases and barriers that exist within healthcare. And it's no wonder that so many people are still struggling to get the diagnosis and support they need.
Especially marginalized communities who might already face barriers to accessing quality healthcare.
It's about recognizing those disparities and working to create a more equitable and inclusive system for everyone.
Okay, so before we go, I want to leave our listeners with something to ponder. Because we've covered a lot of ground today, and I think it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the information out there.
It's a lot to process for sure.
It is. So, if you take away just one thing from this deep dive, let it be this. Be kind to yourself, be kind to others, and remember that everyone is on their own unique journey.
Beautifully said. And don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it.
Yes, there are so many amazing resources and communities out there, both online and in person. You don't have to navigate this alone.
And never underestimate the power of human connection. Finding your people can make all the difference.
Okay, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this awesome deep dive.
It's been a pleasure chatting with you, as always.
The feeling is mutual. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insights with us today.
Anytime.
And to all our amazing listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery. We'll catch you next time for another deep dive into the fascinating world of, well, everything. Until then, stay curious, stay kind, and keep on learning.
Keep those deep dives coming. See you next time.
Bye, everyone.